Today is Friday, the fourth day of the trial. They had Officer BM with the FBI, Officer John Niter, and Officer 1 and 2 today testifying. It was quite an interesting day to be there to hear their testimonies. It was emotional for me. It was hard to keep my composure at times, but I know that the Lord was with me to help comfort me. As I'm sitting there listening to these men describe my husband or the people that were involved as militia, armed terrorists, basically. They didn't use the word terrorist. However, they continued to say that they were armed and dangerous. And I kept thinking to myself, this is, based on the threat assessment that they received from probably Dan Love. And we have learned since then that the threat assessment that was given to the Oregon officials was tampered with, and it was manipulated and falsified. And so these men were not dealing with a true description of Ammon and Ryan and Lavoy and the men that were there. They were not militiamen. My husband was not in a militia. I will keep saying that until I can no longer speak. It was interesting during Officer Niter's testimony. He was describing how the radios kept failing and weren't working, that they had to use the Oregon State Police radio to communicate. Every single one of the officers testified to the fact that as Lavoy approached the kill stop in his truck, that they all heard him accelerate. However, as we're watching the video, as they're describing that, and we're watching Lavoy's truck, the brake lights are on, okay? And then they describe how they feel that Lavoy was intentionally heading for their fellow officer, John Niter. And that's not what I saw in the video either. When it's enhanced, you can clearly see the brake lights. You can clearly see my husband jolt right at the last minute. Just as you see that officer leap out into the way, you see Lavoy jolt even more with his truck. But they clearly have a narrative. They clearly want to demonize my husband, even though Asatrita is on trial for making these shots and then lying about it. They are successfully painting their picture, their narrative, and demonizing my husband as a man who was wanting to do them harm, which was completely false. I know him. He would have never. In fact, that's the reason he didn't plow through that roadblock. That's the reason he jolted the truck at the last second not to hit that officer who jumped in front of him unexpectedly. If he had wanted to hurt somebody, he would have. As it continued, the testimonies, they testified to the fact that they could hear shots going off. And BM specifically stated that Asatrita was next to him in the area that he was standing in behind the truck for protection. And he said he later saw a casing on the ground, which I found to be very interesting. There were a couple officers that said that they saw a shell casing in the ground in that area between the three vehicles in that V formation, but later it disappeared. There was no record of it. Nothing was taken into evidence. In fact, there were no casings that were taken into evidence. That was testified to in court. I'm looking at my notes because so much information. You sit there all day long and you hear sometimes the same things over and over again by these officers, and then when they cross-examine, you're hearing the same thing from not only the person testifying, but you're hearing the defense even put across their narrative of how the militia and the threat was clear. They make a lot of statements rather than ask questions. There was testimony to the fact that Asatrita had to be asked to calm down, that he was really amped up, and 2 or 3 officers did testify to the same thing, that his behavior was odd, he was excited, and he was told to be quiet and to calm down. After the shots were fired and Lavoie was killed and they had secured the truck, there was testimony to the fact that BM, Asatrita, and Niter all went to the front of the truck and examined it, where they could find where they did find a bullet hole there, and they had some discussion amongst themselves about that bullet. And then later on in the night, you know, maybe a half hour later or so, but it was dark by then, they are looking for, well, they're testifying that they're picking up their flash spoons and the different things that they're trying to pick up, because they're sensitive materials that need to be picked up and gathered. But then all of a sudden, that one shell casing that was in that area next to BM and Asatrita comes up missing. I find that curious. There was some conversation about that particular casing amongst the officers in reference to, was that a 308 casing or was that a 223 casing that we saw there? Was that yours or was that ours? That was the kind of conversation that was going on between the OSP and the FBI. But yet the casing disappeared. There was a point in the investigation a few days later where they interviewed the FBI agents that were involved, and they did it in a group, as a group, and that is contrary to normal protocol. The reason that they don't normally interview agents or anyone in a group is because there's problems with that. One, the different individuals get to hear each other's testimony, and then the answers get confused or skewed. Maybe they're afraid to tell what they know in front of another person, so they generally don't interview suspects or officers in this case to find out what their narrative, what they saw or what they did in a group. So I find it very interesting. That was the FBI insisting upon having that interview as a group. Officer number 2, that's when it got a little bit difficult for me. Officer number 2 was brought into the courtroom, and he proceeded to go through the events of that day and how he shot at my husband. He talked about the interviews and about the information that was coming their way beforehand, about all of the threat assessment that they had been given, and they were considered armed and dangerous individuals. He talked about at the first stop where they used a non-lethal round and shot at Ryan Payne and hit him in the arm, and that the FBI was not happy with the officer from OSP using a non-lethal round at that point. The people in the truck felt like they were being fired upon. They were in fear for their life. They did not feel safe. They didn't feel like it was safe to even get out of the truck. I found it very interesting that one of the officers described a non-lethal weapon as a momentary pain controller. And I wrote that down because I thought of the theory that we have is that Lavoie was being hit with non-lethal rounds, which were causing his hands to go maybe up and down and grabbing his side, because they described it in such a way that it wouldn't cause or break the skin or cause death, but it would be a way to control that person for a moment or two. And I could see that happening with what was happening with Lavoie out there in the middle of the snow. Officer 1 came in. He's the one that shot 2 shots into Lavoie, and he barely got started. He will be first to testify again, to finish his testimony on Monday morning. But he did have a few things to say. You know, like I said, he just began his testimony. He talked about how they had been briefed, because you need to remember officer number 1 is part of a SWAT team in the OSP. He's a special unit. So they had been briefed quite a bit prior to even December about the group that kept coming up to Oregon, and that would have been Ammon, and I don't know who would have been with Ammon, but they had been surveilled clear back in October, November, and December. My husband wasn't up there at that time. My husband didn't go up until January 2nd to stand for the Hammonds. But the rumor was that this Ammon was going to be willing to stop the Hammonds from turning themselves in. And that was not the case. I don't know of anything like that. I know my husband wouldn't have participated in anything like that. And so I found that interesting. But that just goes to show you how much they were ramping up the threat with these officers. The threat assessment that was going to them made them in fear for their lives. And they portrayed Ammon and Ryan Payne and Lavoie and all of the other men and women that were at Malheur as these hardened criminals that were ready to start World War III. I found it interesting also that the Forest Service, the FBI, the BLM, the Oregon State Police, and the HRT team were all involved in the planning of Malheur. They were all involved at one level or another in putting together the kill stop and in organizing the security that was coming into their town. That is my update for today. Again, I appreciate all of you who continue to stand with me and my family and who continue to support us in every which way that you do. We're determined to see this thing through to the end, to hold them accountable for killing Lavoie. I believe that they could have, watching the tapes and listening to these officers, they didn't even try to use non-lethal force on my husband. They could have used that taser. They could have found another way to bring him down. They did not need to kill him. He never drew a weapon. And I am not satisfied with them feeling like they might have been threatened. I'm not satisfied with that. You can't feel that way. You need to see that you're going to be in some harm. That's the way it used to be. You had to see a weapon before you could shoot. They're changing things, people. We need to hold them accountable, and we need to push back on this new regulations that are out, and they need to go back to the training that they used to rely on. They go back to being our public servant. Anyways, thank you so much. I love you all. God bless.